I have a question for you. What is the interval between these two notes? Is it 6 semitones? Is it a diminished fifth? Is it an augmented fourth? I'll ask another question. How would you comment on the amount of water in this picture? Is it 500 mils? Is it half empty? Or is it half full? In this video, I'll demonstrate how intervals are expressed, calculated, and their importance in what I call directionality. I mentioned before that I struggled quite a bit with intervals when I was younger, in particular the quality number kind, such as major seventh or minor third. As I grew older and got exposed to more and more music theory, I began to understand why intervals were such a challenge for me. First of all, the naming convention felt arbitrary. We have major seconds and minor sixths, but not major fifths or minor octaves. Things got worse when I was asked to name the interval of two notes with accidentals. Those were tough. Secondly, I saw no use of such a naming convention when we could all be jolly happy with calculating intervals using tones and semitones. However, over time, as I played more music, sight-read more pieces, and wrote more compositions on my own, I came to realize that there was a subtle yet significant importance of measuring intervals differently. Well, alright, let's all get our hands dirty and get down to the nitty-gritty. By far, the simplest way to count intervals, especially with an instrument in hand, this method measures the absolute gap between two notes. Forgive me when I incorporate terminology from my other passion, mathematics and sciences, but when I say absolute, I mean without any regard for direction. Let's revisit the diagram I showed earlier. Between this note here and this note here, there are exactly 6 steps in between. It doesn't matter if we count the steps from here or from here. The distance is absolute. We call this distance 6 semitones or half tones, 3 tones, or better known as a tritone. When we measure intervals this way, we are only interested in the gap between two notes. Don't worry, I'll try my best to explain the steps as simply as possible. First of all, in any major scale, the intervals formed between the tonic and the other degrees have the following names. To summarize, all intervals are defined to have a major quality except for the 4th, 5th, the unison, and the octave, which have a perfect quality. We'll come to the why later, I promise. The next thing we need to establish is that if a major interval is shrunk by a semitone, it becomes minor. Shrinking further, diminished. On the other hand, if a major interval is expanded by a semitone, it becomes augmented. As for perfect intervals, the variation is much simpler. Shrinking by a step gives a diminished quality, whereas expanding by a step gives an augmented quality. Now, if we were asked to determine the interval of this dyad, how would we start? Right, first, form a major scale starting on the lower note. Stop at the point where the scale reaches the staff position of the upper note. This gives the number. Next, compare the upper note with its counterpart in the major scale we just formed. In the major scale, this B is supposed to be a B natural. However, in this dyad, it is a B flat. If it was a B natural, then the interval would have been a perfect fifth. But since it is a B flat, which is one step lower than B natural, the quality changes from perfect to diminished. Finally, combining both the number and the quality, the interval formed by this dyad is a diminished fifth. When we measure intervals this way, we are actually imparting the attribute of direction. In particular, we have to measure it from the lower note going up. Calculating from the upper note won't work if we stick to using the major scale. Additionally, this sense of directionality can be extended further. Perfect, major, and minor intervals are deemed to be stable, meaning there is no restriction whatsoever in terms of the interval that can come after. But augmented and diminished dyads often limit the kind of intervals that can come after. In particular, augmented intervals tend to expand outwards towards a stable quality. Diminished intervals, on the other hand, tend to shrink inwards. For instance, take this excerpt from Mozart's Fantasia in C minor. The interval here is a diminished seventh. Let's see what comes after. G and D with an interval of a perfect fifth. The number has reduced from a seventh to a fifth. Notice also that the quality has shifted from the unstable diminished to a stable perfect. Now let's look at this pair. This outer interval is an augmented sixth. Look at what's next. A perfect octave. In this pair, the interval number has increased from a sixth to an octave, and just like before, the quality has shifted towards a stable, perfect one. This is what I like to call directionality. This is primarily due to notes that are out of context, striving to move minimally towards notes that are in context. For instance, the F in the keys C major and C minor is defined to be F natural. But in this example, the F is raised to F sharp, rendering it out of context, demanding to be resolved upwards to G, which is within the context of both C major and C minor alike. Extending this concept further, it allows us to look at chords within a larger context instead of scrutinizing a single harmony on its own. To put it back into context, a dyad is augmented because it is on its way to becoming a larger interval, and a dyad is diminished because it is on its way to becoming a smaller interval. Now, going back to the cup analogy, if you say this cup is filled with 500 ml of water, you are measuring it in tones and semitones. If you say this cup is half empty, you are looking at a diminished interval. And if you say this cup is half full, you are looking at an augmented interval. In this video, we've taken a look at how intervals can be measured. Specifically, we looked at two methods, measuring using tones and semitones, and measuring with quality and number. The first method gives the size of the gap between any two tones. The second method, on the other hand, gives the size of the gap between any two notes and the direction in which the next harmony can move. Perfect, major, and minor intervals are stable and can be followed by any interval. But augmented intervals prefer to be followed by a stable interval with a larger number, whereas a diminished interval prefers to be followed by a stable interval with a smaller number. This video may seem to be pointless, but trust me when I say that harmonic progressions and melody design will make so much more sense when we incorporate the idea of directionality. And that one will be for another video. For now, the main takeaway is that interval expressions are not arbitrary. And also, of course, that harmonies have to be viewed in context instead of singly. I haven't forgotten that I promised to explain why perfect intervals are perfect, right? So let's get into it. The traditional reason behind it lies in the concept of consonance. In layman's terms, consonance is a state in which two tones blend in with each other without much friction. Scientifically speaking, two tones are said to be more in consonance when their frequency ratio consists of smaller numbers. The perfect fifth interval corresponds to a frequency ratio of 3 to 2. Perfect fourth corresponds to 4 to 3. The octave has a frequency ratio of 2 to 1. In most texts, this is how perfect intervals got their name. As much as I like to agree with this explanation, the engineering and science part in me can't help but feel fairly unconvinced due to the lack of rigor. I mean, where do we draw the line for the frequency ratios? It took me a while, but I have a way to explain it very scientifically. But we'll need to get rid of the existing names for qualities. By default, let's assign all intervals formed from the tonic and the other degrees a pretty quality. Take this dyad D and F sharp. Since F sharp does indeed belong in the D major scale, the interval is a pretty third. Now let's invert the dyad by moving the D up an octave. Now construct a major scale on the now lower note F sharp. We know for sure that the D in F sharp major has a sharp, but in this dyad the D is a D natural. As a result, the quality is no longer pretty. In fact, it is one step less than a pretty interval. So let's call this quality ugly. So this particular interval is an ugly sixth. From here, we can already see that the inverse of a pretty interval is an ugly one, and vice versa. But what about the fourth? Let's try D and G. Forming the D major scale, we see that G indeed belongs in D major. So this is a pretty interval. Inverting this dyad gives G and D. Now, forming the G major scale, we see that D also belongs in G major. We established earlier that if an interval has a pretty quality, its inverse will be ugly, and vice versa. But in this particular case, the quality stays the same even when inverted. This has to be assigned a different quality altogether. And since this quality stays the same when inverted, let's call it perfect. Of course, this is just how I convince myself. The exact reason why perfect intervals are named as such is unbeknownst to me. Anyway, this is a good way to distinguish between the various qualities of intervals nonetheless.